Welcome you all to the joint webinar on the state of urban climate finance, a focus on financial flows towards urban adaptation and support for project preparation, jointly organized by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Global Education and Training Institute, together with the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance and the Making City Resilient 2030. We are very pleased to have our speakers, Idan Sasson and Priscilla Negreiros from Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance with us today. And at this moment, I would like to invite our head of office of Northeast Asia and Global Education and Training Institute of UNDRR, Mr. Sanjaya Bhatia, for an opening and the welcome remarks.
Thank you, Mai, and welcome to all the participants, and a special welcome to Idan and Priscilla. As most of you know, the Making Cities Resilient campaign came to an end in December 2020 after a very effective 10 years, in which we saw more than 4,300 cities join the campaign. And now, as of January, we have started a new initiative for the next 10 years, which is focusing, along with the advocacy, also on the implementation, and especially on the implementation of DRR actions, which the cities have determined they need to take. And that is called the Making Cities Resilient 2030, so MCR 2030. And one of the feedbacks that we received during the last 10 years of the Making Cities Resilient campaign was that, firstly, that there needs to be a greater focus and support to facilitate the implementation of DRR actions by cities, so to reduce urban risks and to achieve greater resilience. And amongst the challenges, one of the important ones was finance, and this was not about finance in the sense of getting the money, but more about what are the options available to cities to finance the various actions and how they can access these options. So with that in mind, we have started this series, and there will be more webinars following. But today, it's a pleasure to work with the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. And we have the two speakers, Priscilla and Idan, from this alliance. And they will be introducing the alliance and also some of these options which you might find useful. So with that, I hand over the stage, the floor, to Priscilla and Idan.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, May and Sanjaya and all the organizers of at UNDRR and Getty for the invitation. It's an honor to speak with such a large and diverse public about urban climate finance and the work that we have been doing in Climate Policy Initiative and the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. So thank you very much for the invite. So let's first set the agenda so you know what we are talking about today in this next 1.5 hours. So I will initially brief you in this introduction about who we are. So what is Climate Policy Initiative? And what is the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance? Then we'll jump in to do an overview of urban climate finance, raise some challenges and opportunities, and finally do a deep dive into the state of urban climate adaptation finance. We know that many of you and the public here is particularly interested in resilience and adaptation, and we want to make sure that we talk about this today. And finally, we will discuss project preparation resources. So we definitely think that project preparation is a very important stage at when we are actually trying to look for climate investments. So we definitely want to give you some resources and other material that you can deep dive if you continue to be interested in everything we will talk about today. So we hope that happens. And finally, we'll have some time for discussions. I'm just reinforcing what May and Sanjaya mentioned. Feel free to send us questions. We might answer live in the Q&A or bring it up to the discussion, and comments are very welcome too. So let's start with an overview of who we are. So both me and Idan, we work for Climate Policy Initiative, which is an analytical and advisory organization with deep expertise in policy and finance. So we aim at assisting governance, business, financial institutions to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. So we are very focused on finance, and more precisely working on how to raise finance for climate investments. So CPI has actually 6 main offices in the world, and we focus on developing countries and climate impact. One of the big projects of CPI, and the project that I'm actually managing, is the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. So CPI hosts the Secretary of the Alliance since 2019. So apart from working more broadly with climate finance, we have this very important stream, which is focusing on cities and how cities can actually increase their access to climate finance. So the Alliance, as we call it, is a multi-level and multi-stakeholder coalition aimed at closing the investment gap for urban and subnational climate projects and infrastructure worldwide. As you're going to see in the next slide, we have 60 members, more than 60 members. So they go from city networks to private and public financial institutions, national governments, many UN system organizations such as UNDRR, NGOs, research organizations. So basically the main players that concentrate and do work with cities directly and also produce knowledge on the urban climate finance space. The goal of all these members and the Alliance itself is basically to mobilize finance for city climate action at scale, thinking about 2030. So we plan to do that by first, amplifying the ambition of the members, so making sure that the members that we work with are doing in coordination and are being effective in what they're doing, but not less important, trying to what we call bridge the demand and supply. So along this investment chain for city level climate related finance. And what it means is basically connecting the public that can finance cities and cities projects that are related to climate action. So we do that by making cities a priority. So building awareness of city needs and opportunities, identifying gap solutions, supporting new investment solutions, and crafting a strong architecture of urban climate finance. And in this specific point, that's a lot of what you're going to see today. So trying to come up with definitions, understanding the players, and making sure this area and the knowledge is spread out to the players that we think are the most important to make the changes happen. So we do that through thematic action groups. We have free project preparation, enabling frameworks, and one on finance called Financial Toolbox, but through other many activities that we have. And we hope that you can learn a bit more about that today with us. Finally, the Alliance also hosts LUCI, which is the Leadership of Urban Climate Investment. LUCI was launched in the UNSG, so the United Nations Secretary General Climate Action Summit in 2019. And by being this framework, LUCI is this framework that elevates and tracks the activities of the Alliance members. LUCI aims at achieving the targets that you can see on the screen and basically promote a real change in the urban climate finance space. So for that to happen, we need to be ambitious, we know that. And really improve the urban climate finance and infrastructure development. So we need to achieve these targets, improve coordination, and LUCI is basically what it's aiming at. So now I'm happy to give the floor to Idan, who will talk a bit more about the state of urban climate finance today. And yes, thank you, Idan, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Priscilla, and thank you to the organizers at UNDRR and Getty for giving us the opportunity to share some of our work with you. And also thank you all the participants for taking the time to join us for this webinar. But prior to getting into some of the data and information that we want to share with you, we'd also like to lay out some critical points as to why we focus on cities. So many of you will already heard some of these points, but it's important to really hammer it down. You know, cities are in many ways at the forefront of the climate crisis. They account for about 75% of the world's carbon emissions and natural resource consumption. They also produce or are responsible for around 50% of total waste. So with significant increased estimated population growth, there's really a need to focus on climate resilient infrastructure and urban planning to support this shift. Cities are also at risk. Many of us know this here and are involved with mitigating that risk. So many cities are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. By 2050, nearly 600 low-lying coastal cities, totaling around 1 billion urban dwellers, are projected to face significant sea level rise. But there's going to be also a range of other extreme measures, from heat and cold, being exposed to temperatures that put lives and livelihoods at risk. Actually, just this week in Texas, in the United States, some of you might have seen some unprecedented freezing conditions. That's just a recent example. Entire cities in the dark. I just saw images this morning of people boiling snow because pipes are frozen or water systems are not working. So, you know, these are just some examples of how cities are going to really have to deal with some unprecedented future realities. And I think part of the point of this is to state that, you know, financial risk is going to increase as well. And that's where we come in on the financial side of cities and climate. So just, you know, one statistic: on average, due to loss of flooding, around $6 billion are lost annually. And this can increase to $50 billion by flooding alone by 2050 in coastal cities. So what does this all mean, all these risks on both the financial side, but also on human vulnerability? It means that the urgency to act is clear. So globally, there's an annual range of $1 to $5 trillion need to ensure that cities can stay on a Paris-aligned development path between now and between now and 2030, excuse me, which is more than 1% of global GDP per year. So that is a very significant sum. And part of the reason that we are here today and that many of you are here today is because this urban climate friendly infrastructure is not realized at the scale and speed required. So many cities, financiers, and national governments have the good intentions and may understand the urgency to act, but the efforts don't always overlap. So despite this crucial role that cities play, they also face several barriers in actually getting that finance that's required to implement climate-friendly infrastructure at that scale. So there are a number of institutional barriers that I'd like to walk through. So many governments and municipalities are really unlikely to finance the infrastructure demand themselves. This could be due to budget restrictions, high levels of debt, and a number of other reasons. Many municipalities also lack the technical capacity to prepare some of these large green infrastructure projects that are needed. These are often complicated multi-year investments and engineering proposals that need to work through, and there's a certain technical capacity challenge as well. But oftentimes international public funding needs to go through national governments, and this can limit the ability of cities to receive direct financing, as many of you may have experienced in your own urban contexts. But there's also a host of different financial barriers. So access to finance is also limited by a low rate of credit worthiness. This is, I think, a pretty interesting and kind of difficult statistic. The World Bank indicates that less than 5% of the 500 largest cities in developing countries have the credit worthiness to actually access international capital markets, and only 20% of those 500 cities in local capital markets. So it's very hard to actually access finance from a credit worthiness perspective. But there's also a lack of investor-ready bankable projects. And this is a point that we focus on a lot at the Alliance and that Priscilla will speak to later on as well. So although there's various project support facilities that have been developed in recent years, cities have much larger needs than that support that's actually available. And there may be representatives of cities and technical assistance facilities here that could attest to some of those limitations. Another issue is actually the perception or low returns forecasted by investors. So many cities lack some of the detailed evidence on the financial and sustainability components of projects, which is a requirement for investors to make some of these related decisions. There are also a host of knowledge barriers. So on the supply side, private investors often lack the comprehensive understanding of sustainable urban infrastructure or how climate finance operates at the subnational level. This topic is still new to many people and to many industries and organizations and municipalities, financiers, and others. But sometimes the scope of infrastructure projects can actually be mismatched with the administrative boundaries of cities. And this is a point that we'll get to later when actually having to define urban climate finance. So on top of these barriers, we have to also address kind of the current reality, and the pandemic has absolutely exacerbated many of these pre-existing challenges. And we've seen this primarily play out in cities over the last year. UN Habitat estimates that around 95% of total COVID-19 cases have happened or been reported in urban areas. And it's really important to note that residents on the margins of urban society, both in the global north and the global south, will continue to be disproportionately impacted by COVID and its effects, especially as issues of inequality are intensified. So while the first order impact of COVID is clearly linked to public health and social challenges, there are also significant impacts on municipal finance. So just to list a few here, these are kind of 4 key ways that municipal finance has been impacted through this pandemic. There's been a significant decrease in local revenues. So cities are facing large budget cuts around the world, from taxes and service fees, like some transport and housing, which are often large sources of revenues for municipal governments. COVID has also required increased spending on healthcare, social protection, maintaining basic services. These come at very high costs. And this has led to, in many cases, capital expenditures being put on hold. So sometimes long-term capital spending has been reallocated to dire and immediate operational needs. But we've also seen uneven assistance from national, international, and private sources, which is a really important point that I'll speak to a bit further. So given the significance of this shock to the system, we actually recently put out a report, we at the Alliance, on urban climate finance and COVID-19. So we looked into the financial flows into cities as part of the COVID recovery funds, and also recommendations for how cities can and should be included in national stimulus packages and other recovery funds. Excuse me. So we won't be able to go into all the findings here from that report, but there will be a link to it. But we did find that out of over the $20 trillion that have been pledged globally for the COVID-19 recovery, only around $1 trillion have been committed to cities. So as you would assume, the bulk of this funding, at around 80%, has been for short-term liquidity to help cities with those short-term immediate needs. But nearly $200 billion of those remaining funds, both from direct financial institutions, also from national governments, have actually very few details on programming or disbursement. And we actually see this as an opportunity to work with some of these DFIs and governments to effectively program a significant share of that funding through cities. So again, we have a link to the report. There's a lot of very interesting information on COVID and urban climate finance. But it's with this context of the barriers, of the importance of cities, of the climate impacts, that we approach the topic of urban climate finance. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand what are the financial flows going towards cities today. And this is important for a host of different reasons. So on one hand, when compared with investment needs, track progress can actually be a really powerful motive for stakeholders to address some of those barriers that actually limit capital flows into cities. So this kind of information can really help identify gaps and opportunities, also to ensure more effective deployment of national, local, and international resources. Beyond that, tracking and climate investment can also give a clearer picture of what financial instruments are generally employed and what kind of innovative mechanisms can bring capital into cities. So knowing where we stand on that can lead to some better policy planning, again, that could target those specific gaps. And there's gaps by sector. We're going to get into mitigation versus adaptation, region, but also different sources of finance. And Climate Policy Initiative, which is where we work, has been actually tracking global and national climate finance flows for the last decade. But since last year, we've really started to do a deep dive into urban climate finance investments so that we can make that case of the importance of increasing investments into cities. And all of this work is actually going to be published in a forthcoming State of Cities Climate Finance report that's being produced by the Alliance. That's going to be a big update on a report that was last done 5 years ago. Before getting into the data, though, it's important to again note the challenge of defining what exactly is the urban when we're talking about urban climate finance, so that we can understand those investment flows, both with mitigation and adaptation into cities today. So to come up with these numbers, CPI and the Alliance have created a global definition and a taxonomy on urban climate flows. And there's a lot of kind of complex methodology behind it. And I'd encourage you to check out the reports that we have if you're interested. But our definition is fairly straightforward, but also comprehensive. And we're looking at different resources directed to activities that both limit city-induced greenhouse gas emissions, but also aim to address climate-related risk facing cities. So for mitigation, on the mitigation side, this means resources directed to reducing, again, or avoiding GHG emissions. And adaptation refers to activities that reduce the vulnerability of human or natural systems to the impacts of climate change. But this definition also touches on a critical question about urban boundaries. And I'm sure a number of the city officials and practitioners have come across this when you've had to define what authority is responsible for a given project, as a lot of times those authorities can overlap or there are certain gaps. So just to give a small example, a project to expand a reservoir that might be critical to deal with urban water scarcity may geographically be based outside of a given city, but if the benefits are going to those urban dwellers and to the city itself, that would count as urban adaptation finance. But another program, for example, reinforcement of river basins, that would only count as urban adaptation if it occurs within the city boundary. So this is a pretty detailed level of information and data that is required to track these flows, and oftentimes that information is not there. So it is quite a challenge, but we have come up with a robust methodology for this. So all this leads us to ask just how much climate finance is being invested in cities today. So just for context, we've done prior research on this, and that has indicated that over the next 10 years, more than 70% of low emission and climate resilient infrastructure will be needed in urban areas globally. So I think this is pretty astounding. The value of infrastructure required in urban areas over the next 10 years could be greater than the $50 trillion value of all the infrastructure in the world today. So this is kind of enormous projections looking forward at rapid growth over the next decade even. So in light of this enormous demand, understanding the urban climate finance gap is really critical, as I was stating before. So analysis conducted for our previous State of Cities Climate Finance report estimated a need of approximately $400 billion to $1 trillion of more capital investment needed to make this urban infrastructure low emission and climate resilient. But at today's investment rate, we're seeing less than half of that target met. So it's really important to note that these precise figures are being updated, and we look forward to releasing the report, and will be shared with you when that does come out a bit later this year in a few months. But this also aligns with some of the other research that we've done on climate finance. So from Climate Policy Initiative's global landscape of climate finance, we've seen that more than 90% of total climate finance goes towards mitigation. And this really aligns with some of our preliminary findings that less than 5% of urban climate finance is going towards adaptation. So I want to repeat that again. Right now, our preliminary findings are stating that less than 5% of urban climate finance is going towards adaptation. That means there's a huge disparity there when we're thinking about mitigation versus adaptation finance in cities, which makes the work of UNDRR and practitioners in the urban resilience space that much more important. So with this in mind, we're going to do a deep dive into urban climate adaptation finance, or thinking about it as urban resilience finance. The data that we're going to be presenting in some of the following slides is actually based on a recent report that the Alliance and CPI have done along with the Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council. Excuse me. So just shifting to some of our objectives in this next section, we'd really like to focus on the financial flows to urban climate adaptation. And we want to understand what are the specific gaps, what are the specific opportunities, and then what are some areas for future research. So we're going to provide an overview and case studies of the financial instruments utilized by cities, and also other instruments that are available to finance urban climate adaptation projects. So after discussing many of the barriers, we think it's really important to emphasize that there are cases of success. And luckily, my colleague Priscilla will be able to give you a kind of rosier picture of the state of urban climate adaptation finance in terms of some of those instruments. And then finally, we're going to share some concrete resources that cities can utilize to both gain support in project preparation, but also kind of more information on this topic. So diving right into it, the following are just some key takeaways from our research. So according to our report, around $6.8 billion were invested annually in 2017-18 in urban adaptation finance projects. So again, that represents less than 5% of estimated total urban climate finance. And this falls significantly short of the World Bank's estimated need of around $11 to $20 billion annually in cities in emerging and developing countries alone. So that's an enormous disparity when we're thinking about it. And this is an estimated figure to protect global urban infrastructure from climate risk. In terms of sectors receiving this finance, water and wastewater management projects have received the most, followed by disaster risk management. And in almost all regions, extreme heat, flooding, and sea level rise were the most common hazards. And this came out of a report commissioned by, done by CDP to a number of different city governments. So looking a bit more specific on the climate hazards, the CDP City Survey, which features more than 800 city responses, reported that in 2018, around 85% of cities reported major climate-related disruptions. So this includes flooding and extreme weather events, heat waves, droughts. And this chart that we're looking at here actually shows the number of reported projects by climate hazard. So this could indirectly tell us what are the primary hazards of concern for cities. But these climate risks also have quite high costs. So this graph here that you now see, this shows project costs reported by climate hazard. So we can see that storm, wind, and extreme precipitation are leading the bulk of financial impact for risk reduction when we think about it in terms of the cost of these projects. And these are just showing direct impacts from singular climate hazards. But as practitioners in the urban space, we know these are oftentimes interdependent. So it's not just about flooding, but that might affect other urban systems as well. So beyond direct impact, cities are also facing some other chronic risks that are intensified by climate change. So this can include things like increased risk of disease spread, or also the potential for significant population shifts. We're expecting a range of internal migration from rural areas as rural populations face climate-related economic and climate shocks into cities in search of different economic opportunities. So we're again expecting to see a big shift. The World Bank estimates that over 140 million people could be forced to internally migrate by 2050. So these are big shifts happening that require strategic and long-term planning that are each independent with one another. Turning now to the data on the sectors that we've been able to collate, it's unsurprising based on some of the other information that we've received that water and wastewater management gained a majority of the finance on average in 2017 and 18. So a significant sum of that total, about 60% was spent on water and wastewater management, and that stands at around $4 billion USD. But this is followed by disaster risk management, finance that can go to emergency planning, but also other infrastructure. But we know that there are various types of urban adaptation and resilience projects underway. So the leading types of these types of projects, this includes risk mapping, planning, policy development, different nature-based solutions, awareness and education campaigns. So interestingly enough, what we're seeing here in terms of the project types is that infrastructure resilience doesn't actually top the list. And I think it's an important reminder that resilience and adaptation go beyond just the built environment and points to different elements like social resilience, which can oftentimes be left out of the conversation, but that also requires financing for different programming, operations, and so on. But nonetheless, we know from our finance tracking that many of these projects are not financed. So how are cities actually financing these urban adaptation projects? So if we're seeing funds flowing to cities, what type of financial instruments can they gain access to? So we're now going to do a shift and discuss the type of finance, the financing sources, the financing instruments. But I think, perhaps more interestingly or importantly, we're going to get into some of those case studies that show how these instruments can be utilized. But it might be helpful to go through this chart here to think about the different options available. So the first source of funding that cities have access to would be public funds. So as would be logical with public funds, we can divide it into municipal, state, or regional and national government funds. So for municipal government, funding for urban adaptation comes from revenue generation from a variety of different sources. This could include utility fees, taxes, bonds, other financial instruments. So, this would be things like property taxes, sales taxes. These are the main revenue sources that cities have to pay for things. But other instruments like land value capture, green bonds, other instruments would represent a slightly more innovative approach to thinking about how to raise revenue, but oftentimes these require higher level capacity or technical assistance. State, regional, and national governments also utilize a range of financial instruments to either directly transfer funds to municipalities or provide funds through instruments like project debt, infrastructure funds, and other such instruments. So apart from their own resources, national and regional sources, cities can also have access to public finance. And so this would be finance mostly coming through development financial institutions. So these are kind of, for the most part, the public banks. So multilateral development banks like the World Bank, national development banks, bilateral banks or development institutions, as well as different dedicated climate funds. And there are a few different financial instruments that are covered by public or development finance. So the first would be grants, and these are transfers made in cash, goods, sometimes services, where no repayment is required. So when thinking of grants, I think that's kind of key, is no repayment is required on grants, as is often the case. In terms of project level debt, it's another instrument that can be utilized. This would be debt relying on a project's cash flow for repayment. So oftentimes dependent on the actual, perhaps the revenue generation from a given project. And there are different ways of creatively engineering or designing or planning resilience or adaptation infrastructure to have multi-purpose or multiple benefits to go beyond just, let's say a sea level wall, but how do you enhance public space or enhance public transportation? Oftentimes revenue generation or ways of financial sustainability can come beyond just a singular use for infrastructure or planning. There's also low cost or concessional debt. And so this would refer to loans that are extended at terms below market rate. Low cost concessional would be below market rate. And then market rate debt would refer to loans that are extended at regular market conditions. And sometimes this also comes from development finance institutions. But beyond debt to finance these projects, these institutions also fund other sort of assistance, so technical assistance, sometimes risk mitigation or credit enhancement at the transaction level, other aspects of climate infrastructure development beyond just the costs of building or planning a project. So finally, there's the private sphere of financing, and that's going to also cover a range of different sources and instruments. So you can see here there are commercial financial institutions, institutional investors, private insurance, different corporate actors, households, which actually play a significant role, but also philanthropies and other sources of what we'd say are private finance. I won't go through each one of these, but you'll notice that there are perhaps some that stand out that are different financial instruments from the public or development finance that I previously included. One of those would be project level equity. So these would actually be equity investments that rely on a project's cash flow for repayment, but also balance sheet financing. And this would mostly be coming from the corporate actors. And this could be either direct debt or equity investment by a company or a financial institution. So there's a fair kind of level of detail here, but this aligns oftentimes with the methodology that we use when we're thinking about either broadly climate finance or urban climate finance or adaptation finance, and so that we can understand what are the different gaps, what instruments are being utilized, and what is succeeding and what is falling behind. So importantly, what do all these different instruments actually tell us? First, there are in fact many options to finance urban climate infrastructure projects that could be fit for purpose in a number of different type of contexts. But many cities are not always aware of these possibilities, or they might not have the capacity, they may not have the enabling policy or regulatory environments to utilize some of these instruments. And as we'll show in the case studies, the financing of urban climate adaptation projects, particularly in low and middle income countries, often requires a multi-stakeholder approach. So this means municipalities, technical assistance facilities, national government, financiers, all coming on board. And sometimes those stars do align, but it is very difficult to replicate the multi-stakeholder approach that is sometimes needed to get these projects and programs off the ground. So beyond that, we can also see that unlocking private finance will continue to be a big area of opportunity to scale these projects. We all understand that the urgency of the climate crisis, and cities won't be able to rely solely on public finance and funds moving forward in the future to meet that need. So I previously discussed some barriers to urban climate finance more generally, but given the focus and on adaptation and resilience through UNDRR, we wanted to dig just a bit deeper on adaptation, on some barriers to adaptation, and particular to cities and on adaptation finance. So while some of these barriers that I'll speak through, they might be more specific to cities in low and middle income countries, many cities face some of these challenges. And that's, I think, an important thing to note. So first, the impacts of climate change are going to play out very differently in each city, even in different neighborhoods of cities. And cities oftentimes have limited access to robust information or data on interdependent or let alone singular climate risks. So this could be either a data limitation or a technical capacity issue, or a challenge to understand how the broad array of different both public and private assets, but also households, different urban systems could be affected by climate impacts. Second, many cities also have poor market environments specific to adaptation projects. Oftentimes these programs can have very high costs or a kind of long-term or perceived inadequate return on investment, because these are oftentimes preventative measures or adaptation measures. But there's also a lack of internalizing some of those climate risks by private sector actors. And that can really limit the ability of private finance to play a more significant role in scaling adaptation projects. Beyond that, there are also often weak domestic insurance markets without either much precedent or without much capacity to develop and implement insurance-based financial solutions to cities in the face of climate risks. So these are some of the barriers that are more specific to urban adaptation finance. So I know that I may have painted something of a bleak picture when it comes to discussing a lot of these barriers. So I'm very happy that Priscilla, my colleague, can talk about some of the successful case studies and positive developments in the field and in this topic. We think it's very important and to be very clear about those challenges, but we also have to move towards opportunities and some of those concrete resources. So Priscilla, I'll hand it off to you to talk through some of those case studies and successes.
Yes, thank you so much, Idan. And I have been following the questions. Thank you all for sending so many questions. We're going to try to answer some of those. And certainly during the time we have for discussion, continue to answer. So although Idan was talking to you about like the several barriers that cities are facing in urban adaptation and giving examples of concrete financial instruments, we thought that it would be very interesting to bring you up some case studies and innovative financial instruments that can demonstrate positive and successful approaches to urban adaptation finance and that can be implemented in cities. So first, we will present two case studies from the report we have indicated that we have recently launched, and they are successful approaches to finance urban resilience in cities. There are more than 10 in the report, by the way. So if you like to learn a bit more about other examples, we invite you to go there, screen through and learn more about these initiatives. And secondly, what we want to do is introduce you to the Global Innovation Lab of Climate Finance that has played a critical role in supporting and developing innovative financial instruments to address urban climate hazards. So let's jump into the first case study. Actually, it was a project that was implemented in Philippines. I know that we have some people from Philippines here, so that's great. So the instrument, it's called the Philippine City Disaster Insurance Pool. And the Philippines is actually, for those that don't know the region and the country that well, is located in one of the world's most disaster-prone areas. And it's at risk of earthquakes, volcanical eruptions, as well as climate-related hazards, including typhoons, floods, droughts, and landslide. So this pool, this insurance pool, is designed to provide post-disaster finance through a parametric insurance model. So the design of the insurance pool was led by the Philippines Department of Finance and was supported with technical assistance from a multilateral development bank, so the Asian Development Bank. And 10 cities actually participated in the design of this pool and were selected based on factors including disaster risk and risk management, governance, geography, location, and data availability, because these are topics that are quite important, that were important actually to determine this pool. And this is very interesting because the type of insurance coverage is a bit different, because it covers its features pays out. So it's basically pays out. They are determined by the physical features of the natural hazard event. So to give an example, wind speed, rather than the assessed damage. And that made, and it was a lot easier for cities in regions in the country that are covered to rapidly gain access to recovery finance rather than undertake a large-scale assessment that can take time with limited capacity and resources. So the pool is actually an interesting example of a broad local level strategy. So what we call an aggregation mechanism. So like it aggregated different cities in the same country to address a need for rapid access of early recovery finance. It demonstrates also how public finance institutions, national government in that case, and a set of cities can come together to tackle a primary resilience challenge in an innovative way. So this is actually one case study that was quite interesting. The next one that we wanted to talk to you about comes from Dakar in Senegal. So Dakar received support from the C40 Cities Finance Facility, which is a project preparation facility. We will talk a little bit more about that very soon. So, and the idea was to build the business case for hydraulic and landscaping redevelopment of a storm water retention basin. So the project aims to reduce the vulnerability of residents in an affected district to flooding, caused normally in that region, in the city, by heavy short-term rainfall. So the CFF, the C40, the project preparation facility I mentioned, so their assistant allowed the city to identify appropriate finance sources for the project. And then in March 2020, so last year, the World Bank approved a $125 million in concessional credit to support the solid waste management system improvement. So the project in total is expected to be of $295 million with co-finance from other institutions, so the AFD, the AEC, the government of Senegal, and the private sector. And why do we bring up this example? Because first, it's because this specific city has worked with a project preparation facility. So these are important institutions that can assist city in improving their project. One of the main challenges, as Idan mentioned, and most of you know, is actually reaching bankability of the project, and having assistance actually to create the project and project and since the beginning and design it, looking into investments is quite important. And secondly, again, because it demonstrates another example of benefit of aligning different levels of stakeholders when possible, of course, because we know sometimes it's not, for the financing of urban resilience infrastructure. So now, what I want to show you also is that apart from successful projects and case studies specifically, and just to let it clear, so these are some of the case studies that we listed in our report, but of course we didn't participate in them. So I'm sure you're gonna be able to find more information through the report itself, but from the implementers of those case studies. But apart from those projects that have attracted grant and concessional finance, cities also can have access to innovative financial instruments. And by innovative here, I don't mean higher technology, California, social media. I definitely mean innovation in developing financial instruments that actually can respond to market failures. So what happens sometimes is that the market, the financial institutions themselves, that they are not responding to a problem and a demand from a city and from a specific topic around finance and climate finance more specifically. And like that's what we consider innovative financial instruments. So this is the role, and this is what the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance that it's led by CPI does. So what we call the lab is a global public and private sector initiative that aims to drive billions of dollars of private investment into climate change mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. So the lab work as an incubator, supporting the identification and piloting of cutting edge climate finance instruments that can drive this investment and unlock new opportunities for action. So since 2014, the lab has launched 49 solutions to tackle investment barriers in the most critical sectors and regions for action and in climate change. And specifically, as you can see in the slides, like on climate risks, which is what we are interested to talk about today, we have 15 different instruments that were developed by the lab. So I very much like to also invite you to go to the lab webpage and also learn a bit more about these instruments. So in terms of impact, the lab has been able to mobilize through its 49 instruments, $2.9 billion of climate action in developing countries. Out of curiosity, 370 of those were mobilized by lab members, so organizations that we are working closely with. But more than 2 billion were catalyzed of additional investment. And this is interesting because what we can definitely see is that there is a lot of conversation saying the financial sector don't have interest in investing in climate change. But basically, if we are able to create the right financial instrument that will be able to tackle the change, we see definitely an interest. So let me introduce you to two lab instruments so you can understand a bit what we are talking about. So the first one, it's called CRAFT, Climate Resilience and Adaptation Finance Tech Transfer Facility, easier to say CRAFT, but CRAFT is a private equity fund that blends commercial and concessional capital. So for those that don't understand much about the financial market, what does it mean in practice? So it's basically one of the first commercial investment funds vehicles to focus on technologies and solutions for climate adaptation. It has invested in more than 20 companies already, offering climate intelligent products and solutions to climate adaptation. And just one second. And CRAFT is actually innovative because it makes private investment in adaptation attractive. So it brought, like, of course, it talks a little bit broad on adaptation, not only adaptation and resilience focused on cities, but it also, of course, applies to cities. So the proponent and that sent us the proposal and worked with us in this financial instruments is Lightmyth Group, and till today it has mobilized $82.6 million US. So it has a group of partners: the Rockefeller Foundation, KfW, the German Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, alongside public and private investors. So we can definitely see how adaptation can become commercial and private and attract the private sector. Great. The second example we wanted to talk about is a more recent lab instrument. So it's called the Climate Adaptation Notes. So this is a new and innovative structure funding approach that can identify and prepare water and wastewater sector infrastructure projects in Southern Africa that respond to climate-related risks in the region. So this specific instrument combines short-term project financing for construction from commercial banks and long-term infrastructure funding provided by institutional investor. And where is the innovation here? Like how this is different, how this respond to a market failure? It's basically this instrument allows long-term funders to leverage this commercial bank's construction projects expertise, mitigation technical risk, and enabling their investment in the sector previously seen as too risky. So basically what happens is that long-term investors are a bit afraid of actually investing in long-term projects related to adaptation because it might be risky. But this commercial banks, this structure helps to mitigate that. And this new approach enables climate adaptation projects to tap into nearly $300 billion in funding from debt capital market in the region and others. So this is it's being developed. So it's actually was endorsed by the lab last year in September. It's now on its pilot process, and it was proposed by GFA and Climate Infrastructure and Renewable by Nature. And this is also another example of an idea of a financial instruments that can help to tackle some of the barriers for private investment participation in this area. So basically, we want to close this presentation on urban adaptation and urban climate finance with a main message, which is basically we see that cities are facing barriers. It's definitely not easy, specifically the urban adaptation. We saw some numbers that Idan showed us on how there are less investment in urban adaptation than mitigation, for example. But we need to help cities, one, to have access to this information. That's basically our role, to increase sharing knowledge and bring up these case studies and innovative ideas. So you, and I know a lot of people participating here with us are city planners and officials, could help and work better and try to implement some of the ideas. So this is the last part of our presentation. We want to show you some resources we have in the Alliance and from our members that might be useful for you to support your urban climate finance projects, focusing specifically on improving project preparation. So we highlighted a couple of times that bankability, what it's called in the sector, bankability, is very important. So it means sometimes you have a great project, resilient, mitigation related, great climate smart infrastructure project, but not necessarily we have investors from public or private institutions that are interested in that. And making this project goals bankable, meaning attractive for the financial sector, is very important. So project preparation and project preparation facilities may be a very interesting tool to help you to do it. Many cities face challenges in identifying and developing financial viable low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure projects too, which are at the same time, as I mentioned, attractive to public and private financiers. And the project bankability often requires high degrees of technical and financial engineer capabilities. So PPFs can assist cities in that front by supporting different activities at different project level stage. Some project preparation facilities work on concept, design, and scoping of projects. Others do work on pre-feasibility, which includes an assessment of the basic parameters of a project, use it to decide whether to go forward or with more in-depth expensive studies or not. Others do work on feasibility studies. So this would be studies showing the technical details of the project intervention, and others do work on implementation. So we have different project preparation facilities that can help you and assist you with different types of work. The big challenge for cities is actually identifying those project preparation facilities that can actually assist at the project stage that you are now. So the Alliance, trying to answer and respond to that challenge, the Alliance developed a Green City Finance Directory. I think it's the next slide. To help subnational governments and stakeholders to identify project preparation facilities that can support them in developing green and resilience products. So you can see in the slide, the directory, you can definitely find it in our website, the Alliance website. And walking you through a bit the directory, any city, project promoter, or other stakeholder can visit our website, filter for different criteria to help you find a technical assistant or project preparation facility that could support your project. You can filter by country, by sector, by type of support, by project stage. And we recently also launched a new translation setting. So you can not only in English, but you can toggle between language, which can be useful. So we are working hard to keep this as updated as possible. The idea is that you can actually learn about the project preparation facility and reach out directly to them and at least learn. Sometimes they have ongoing application process, sometimes it's once a year, but at least that you increase the amount of information that you have about project preparation facilities. So please visit the directory and send us your feedback and hope it's useful for you. The other resource we wanted to talk about is the GAP Fund. So while there is a shortage in project preparation support for sure for climate infrastructure in cities, and we know that, there was also a major identified gap in the early stage of project development. So project preparation facilities, and we have been working, we have a group in the Alliance that, that work with project preparation facilities. We're reporting that cities were submitting project concepts that needed to be developed before they could be furthered with their technical assistance. So basically, there was a gap on very early stage project development. Trying to respond to this gap, the GAP Fund was created. So many of you probably heard about it. It was launched last year with funding from the German government, the Luxembourg government, and implemented by partners including the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, with support of many city networks, so GCOM, C40, but also GIZ and ICLEI, which is also a city network. And this fund is, again, specifically for early stage support in terms of project definition and pre-feasibility. And the GAP Fund is accepting expressions of interest from cities on a rolling basis. So we would like very much to incentivize you to look. There are a lot of information in the GAP Fund website, it's citygapfund.org, and apply for this support from these partners. And finally, we have mentioned throughout the presentation that the Alliance has produced several reports that may be of your interest. So we have, for example, urban climate finance in the wake of COVID-19. In this report, we were trying to figure it out of the green recovery package that were announced last year by multilateral and development finance institutions and from national governments, how much is flowing to cities. So it has some interesting data there that you can look into. We also produce the enhancing of the role of NDB, so the National Development Banks, trying to bring up this actor of this urban climate finance space and make it the National Development Banks work closely with cities. And we have, as Idan mentioned a couple of times, the Urban Adaptation Finance Report that we share a lot of information with you today about. For this other publication, please visit citiesclimatefinance.org. It's our website. You can also go to the climatepoliceinitiative.org website, where we have other topics related to climate finance, not necessarily only cities, but talking about rural and other areas. And please sign our newsletter. Happy to share more information about this topic and raise the ambition for cities to receive, that's our aim, more finance. So I think on questions, I think that's it. You're going to receive a survey later on asking you some questions about like your topics of interest in this area. If you could answer this, we will be very happy because for sure it will be interesting for us to understand the areas that you are more interested about, so we can produce more work and focus on those areas that will be more helpful to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Idan and Priscilla. It was really very interesting. We have a lot of questions, so let's see how many we can cover in the given time. One question, interesting one. What are your recommendations on financing projects that have low or no revenue generation? For example, non-motorized transport needs substantial infrastructure, but at the same time, there cannot be much user fee attached to it. So any ideas on that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Sanjay. That's a great question. I think is one of the main challenges that cities are facing. So basically, we talk about a lot of bankability, creditworthiness of the cities, but a lot of the projects don't have the rentability that they need. So in that case, of course, like I'm generalizing because each project has its own challenges and specific issues. But like when we showed you the options on like where cities can actually have access, so in that case, probably something on concessional finance and like grants and working with development institutions could be like potentially like a good resource. Again, depending if the project itself cannot have access, there are some interesting, like for example, land use taxes solutions that could like help the city to get not necessarily the fee from that specific project, from another one. Bundling projects could be also an option, aggregating. And of course, like let's say the big answer for that is like for the city to be able to understand and respond to this question itself. Like what we often highlight is that it needs to be like the project has to think about this issue since the beginning. And then that's why we highlight a lot project preparation. So actually, if the city doesn't have the funds and the potential to fund itself through the project preparation process, to look for institutions that can help them. We also are trying to foster a lot the topic of national development banks and national government. So like they could also try to access and support cities in planning those projects. But definitely like working with project preparation facilities would like help them to answer this kind of question since the beginning. I think you're muted. Sorry, Sanjay.
So that approach would also, of course, help the smaller cities. So not just the small projects, but also the smaller cities which have limited revenues. And there was a question on the SIDS, but then small island developing states, because they are comparatively small, and then they are dealing with smaller projects. But I guess this same approach would apply to that also. Yeah. There was another question. How does one become member of the lab?
So The lab specifically, so I don't know the type of institution that would be interesting to be a member of the lab. So basically CPI hosts the lab secretariat. We have a lot of partners from public and private institutions. Most of the partners that are lab members officially, what they do is that give advice, because the lab works as an incubator. So we give technical assistance to organizations that want to create the financial instrument itself. So basically what our members do is give advice, give support, and help us to build this financial instruments. So for example, if it's, I don't know exactly who asked those questions, but if it is like a city that is interesting in or launching a financial instrument or learning more about financial instruments, it wouldn't qualify as a lab member, but it's still like they could or send a proposal, like be a proponent of the lab. Often we have applications open by September, and then we choose, like there is a selection process where the lab, like the winners, let's say, are announced by February, March, and then like they will have technical assistance throughout the year. So like a city that has interest in creating a financial instrument could actually be a proponent of the lab. Or like if you were more interested in learning about different financial instruments that the lab has already launched, we have all of them in our website, and it could be interesting for you. I saw, Sanjaya, sorry, I also saw like a message on how to be a member of the Alliance. Maybe I can jump in and already answer that one.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Basically, the Alliance, we have like a membership process, which is quite lean. You can write to us. The last slide, we have like the Secretariat email. Often members are organizations. We don't have a lot of city members because we work with cities through the city networks that are our members and are very active. So C40, ECLA, UCLG. But definitely what you could do if you're interested in participating and learning more, you can write an email to us, show a bit about your organization. If we think like you, of course, have the criteria that we select organization, you can fill a questionnaire, and the decision on being a member or not is approved by our steering committee. All of this information is in our website too, so make sure you go there if you're interested in joining and sending any questions you have for us.
Okay. We have a question. Given the high percentage of informal settlements in many areas that are affected by climate change, how do you see climate finance leveraged for these under-resourced and overcrowded areas?
Yeah, maybe I can start and then let Idan jump in too. So I think that that's a great question, and we have been often being questioned about like by smaller cities or crowded cities that from developing countries that have like very big issues in terms of like climate risk, how to fund and work with this kind of project. And I think like my answer would be as very similar to the first answer I gave. So when we are working with like informal settlements and areas that are very much affected to climate change, the need for finance is like quick and fast climate finance is even bigger. So of course, like I think what we need in this regions is a consultation of different actors that will go from the city itself, from the private actors that are in the city, from multilateral agencies and development finance institutions to work to find the specific solutions to that. What we can say is that there are some interesting examples on how these areas are starting to build projects and being financed. So for example, the World Bank has a project that's called the CRP that work with helping cities on planning resilience projects and like trying to solve specific issues and climate risks related to settlements. We have a couple of members working specifically in this area that have interesting solutions, but I would say the best approach probably to work collectively. I don't know, Eden, if you want to complement.
Yeah, I think just, to complement everything you said there, I think there's a few other points. I think one is the fact, and we tried to get this across, showing all the different instruments, is the need for an all of the above approach when it comes to financing urban resilience, urban adaptation. So certain financial instruments will be more relevant for certain cities or certain communities or certain projects, while a host of other financial instruments in the forms of grants or concessional loans or other forms might be needed in cases where financing is a challenge. I think beyond that, it's also really important to make the claim and kind of advocate around the fact that cities are only as strong as their weakest or most vulnerable communities. It's very clear from a lot of research on urban resilience planning, on urban adaptation, that you can't just disassociate certain communities from the city as a whole. So many of the different urban systems are reliant on one another. So it's very important that as cities consider what are their risks, what are their vulnerabilities, that it's a whole system approach, and it's not just seeing one community or the political needs of one community or certain individual risks. And I think there's been a lot of work done through UNDRR and the Make Cities Resilient campaign to really kind of demonstrate the importance of thinking about the system as a whole. I think this also partially relates to kind of another question that we saw come up around, why is it that so much more finance is going towards mitigation rather than adaptation? And we've been seeing a few different kind of reasons for that. Again, when we think about the type of projects or the type of sectors that are receiving that finance for either mitigation or adaptation, there's a very strong business case for a range of sectors on the mitigation side. So we're finding a kind of large financial flows into green buildings, into renewable energy, into low carbon transportation, and oftentimes these may have user fees or a private incentive behind it, which enables a greater financial flow towards mitigation. I think beyond that, and many here probably know this, there still seems to be something of a tension up between mitigation and adaptation, given the emphasis, and rightfully so, on the need to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And so much attention has been on mitigating those challenges, lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And I think or kind of what we're finding is that there's a sense that, too much focus on adaptation might steer away from the emphasis or finance needed for mitigation. And so I think what we're trying to show here is that we need a healthy balance of finance into both mitigation and adaptation. And right now that balance is completely off, as we're again seeing almost 95% going towards mitigation projects. And so moving forward, I think all of us that are working and doing research on urban resilience and urban adaptation finance need to really refine some of these arguments. And so we're hoping that the report that we'll be releasing on the state of cities climate finance and the report that we just released on urban adaptation and some of these sessions that we're doing can help communicate and make it clear that we need to draw attention to the adaptation side as well, particularly in cities and low and middle income countries, and particularly in informal settlements and vulnerable communities.
Thank you. There's a very interesting question. One of the issues is accountability along the financing chain. So what is the institution responsible for monitoring the ethics of investment and reporting of climate finance instruments? And how does the Alliance deal with the dark side of finance? Any thoughts?
That's a great question. I had just read it in the chat box, and actually, like our work specifically on CCFLA in the Alliance, and we have some private actors that are members, is basically to foster and to increase knowledge and interest from both sides. So from the financial sector, but also from city officials, from government, on the needs, and call attention from how we need to tackle climate change, and cities are very important in this area. We haven't been working directly on accountability through with private investors. I think it's a bit out of the scope of our work, but definitely this topic on it's very important to follow up and to make sure that the organizations that we are working with and the members of the Alliance are aware and paying attention to this kind of issues, which it's big and probably will continue to grow as the climate emergency it's becoming more and more preeminent globally, and that's some good news. But what we do is making sure that we are following climate policy initiative specifically, while the CPI has worked on global tracking. So although we showed you a lot of information about urban climate finance, we have a global landscape of urban climate finance where we follow a lot of different flows, globally, climate finance in general. And we have been doing some internal work on trying to understand, make the comparison of that with flows, some people call it brown flows, bad flows. So flows that are going to to projects that will not tackle climate change and will make it worse. So we are definitely looking into that, which is not the accountability within financial institutions, but it's also trying to dig a bit into the other side. So hopefully I was able to answer.
If I can just kind of echo that and add on to it, I think from the perspective of CPI and the Alliance, part of the reason that we do a lot of this analysis of financial flows is to really clearly make an evidence-based argument. There might be certain policies or statements put out in the broader world around what's happening in climate. What we're trying to show is what's actually happening on the ground. Through our work on trying to our financial investments aligned with Paris Agreement. So, that's the niche that we, I think, play at the Alliance and at CPI when it comes to thinking about what's actually happening on the ground. What are the statements and promises and commitments? How do some of these compare to what we're really seeing out there?
Okay, there's a question about blockchain technology and if you have any thoughts on that and how that could help cities. So any views on that?
Yes, a very interesting question. Thank you so much for that. CPI and the lab particularly have been looking into blockchain as a tool to actually of course, as a tool to assist and improve the way financial instruments are developed. We have a couple of examples, and actually I think in 2019 we have developed together with a proponent, a specific lab instrument that was using blockchain. And we definitely think this could be an interesting resource to improve the way financial institutions are working and actually using better data to have access to better information. It's very much needed. We work a lot with data, and we know the importance of it. And for investors, it's definitely a big issue. So that's basically, I think, what we could say. And I'll invite, if you go to the lab website, you can see the details of this specific financial instrument. Look for blockchain. And yes, of course, we know that this cannot be applied to all of the sectors and every project. Blockchain is something very specific, in terms of data structure, but definitely an interesting solution for that area.
And there is a question on this. So the private financing that is available for adaptation, how does this compare with the government investment in urban areas for development? And how efficient is the use of these funds, and what actions are required by the civil society to promote?
Good, maybe I can start. So this is a great question too, because it's basically the core and the reason why we started doing this exercise, and we are launching this report on urban climate finance adaptation. Basically, what we are trying to answer this specific question. So how much funds? Eden has showed you some of the data. So comparing private sector with government-led, we're going to launch a new report, hopefully from March on, that we are doing, that Eden also mentioned, the State of Cities Climate Finance Report. We're doing this in partnership with the World Bank and the Atlantic Council. So we're writing together with them. And the idea there is definitely to try to understand not only how much finance is investing in cities, but also who are the main providers from public and private institutions, and also trying to go a little bit deeper, trying to understand where exactly from those institutions this money is coming from. So what is the financial instruments that they are using? We don't have the final data yet, but what I can tell you, and I think what Eden has mentioned, is that definitely mitigation is one of the biggest sector. We know that the private sector in cities is also very important. So a lot of the funding are coming from the private sector, because in a lot of different cities, for example, investments in green buildings, which is a big area for mitigation, for example, and also adaptation, depending on the project, is quite large, and in transport. So the data that we have now shows a lot of participation from the private sector, but still, if we look for individual finance, most of the money come from the public sector. What we think and what we want to highlight is that although, and we can definitely see in the global landscape of climate finance too, we think that the private sector should increase the participation, and that's a lot of what we are doing in our projects, in our work in Climate Policy Initiative as a whole. So trying to actually build with the private sector financial instruments and ideas that can increase their role in climate finance, because although it's still, public finance is very much important in this area, and we need other actors investing. We know that public money will not be enough for all the trillions and billions that we need to invest in this area.
And maybe just kind of adding to that, you know, similar to the question around informal settlements and the kind of the questions around that, I think again we're seeing that it's important to connect the dots between the climate-based risks that we're seeing in cities and the lack of investment in some of these kind of infrastructures and plans that are needed to support them. And so you know, a total of $6.8 billion, as we're showing here in 2017-18, for adaptation infrastructure for finance in cities is not strong enough, and we're seeing that a lot. Most of that, at least on the adaptation side, is coming on the public side. And so again, the question relating to kind of what can cities do, and is it's kind of building the case and connecting the dots around how certain vulnerability, and this also ties into insurance, in certain areas or coastlines or vulnerable communities in cities, they also require private enhancement of funds and planning, because that might also affect private assets and public assets that are needed to support different, you know, private companies and industries that are existing in cities or peripheries of cities. So, you know, we think it's important to also really build that argument around and show that while the private finance might be lagging, there is definitely a case to be made that there's a role there. And we're also looking to continue our engagement both at CPI and the Alliance with the insurance industry. And there's a lot of great work being done through groups like the Insurance Development Forum and others that are looking at adaptation, resilience finance, and insurance, and how to really close that protection gap that cities are facing. And so that's another kind of future area that we're interested in getting involved in.
Thank you. There's a question about I guess the level of support, especially for knowledge gaps. So many cities cannot afford to do a formal vulnerability assessment or a risk assessment, and instead look to historical events instead of the future projections. So there is a knowledge gap, and are you in a position to help cities address this kind of knowledge gaps? So which is a key for a bankable project, yeah.
So definitely that's a great question. So I think like through CCFLA, but I would even mention here the role of city networks they have to play within a lot of different regions. So for example, the ones I mentioned, so C40, ECLA, USLG, and FMDV, and a lot of others that are also our members. First, I think on like the knowledge sharing in the city level, a lot of this work is done and fostered by this city networks. So I think like one step that could be interesting, more on the knowledge sharing than necessarily doing the feasibility study, but I'm gonna get there, is like getting in contact and with this city networks and try to actually be part of those big networks that like have one as one of its main objective, share knowledge and share examples. So I think we should, and that's what we are aiming to do. And I think like being here today in this event is a great opportunity for that too. We want to be able to learn what other cities are doing, understand that probably they are facing the same challenges that other cities are already being able to tackle, and create these platforms of exchange. So one, city networks are a great vehicle to try to solve this issue. We are also using the Alliance specifically to try to do it through like focusing specifically on finance. So making sure that we can showcase what members are doing, that we bring up case studies. I think that was a bit the idea throughout this presentation, and we show like solutions. Specifically on getting access to funding, like for the cities that actually don't have the capacity to do that. And we know, I think Idan even showed a very known number from the World Bank that like project preparation is like from 6 to 7% of the cost, even more maybe, the cost of the project itself. We know that it's often super expensive to do it. So that's when we reinforce again like this participation of project preparation facilities that could come from, sometimes they are not called project preparation facilities. That's why we have a directory in our website to make sure that cities can identify them. But a lot of DFIs, development finance institutions, multilateral banks, have this capacity of assisting cities with pre-feasibility studies and other resources. And again, reinforcing the GAP fund that was recently launched. And I know that they are very much willing to receive proposals from cities. They could be also an interesting tool that we showed, like, because they are giving from EIB, GIZ, the World Bank. Like the idea is that they will give this, depending on the project and the selection process, of course, but they will give this assistance to the city to pull together projects.
Thank you. There's a question on why, in your opinion, why there is such a low amount of finance going into adaptation. Apart from a low return on investment, are there any other reasons?
I don't know if you then want to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think we tried to kind of get into it before. I mean, apart from the low return, there's still, and this goes directly to the question that was just asked before, a knowledge gap in understanding how does that risk, or what are the climate impacts, how do they actually translate into financial risks, or how do you understand what damages can be. There's just a kind of lack of data and information, robust data analysis in many cities to understand what some of those climate risks are. Again, going back to kind of the discourse around mitigation adaptation, we think in the larger picture, in the last decade and longer, there's been rightfully a big emphasis on mitigation in cities, and we've made the claim, and we've seen the data before, that cities are in many ways responsible for a majority of greenhouse gas emissions and consumption, and so there's a big emphasis on cities for these mitigation projects. But on the adaptation side, the case to bring in more private finance kind of needs further refinement and understanding. The data is still an issue. Some of the technologies and infrastructures that are required, if we're thinking about seawalls or large-scale engineering projects, These can be massive multi-year, if not multi-generational projects. But there are a host of different initiatives on the ground that cities are doing and can do that don't have particularly large ticket sizes when it comes to awareness and education and the kind of softer side of social resilience. And so, you know, when we're thinking, and this goes back to some of the barriers that we think about, when we're thinking about some of the limits to bringing investment into cities around adaptation, if we're considering smaller projects or programs that have a small ticket size, that is, don't cost very much, there might be a very high transaction cost associated with getting the finance needed. And so that's where we return to kind of points around aggregation. So what kind of financial intermediaries or financial instruments or vehicles can be utilized to aggregate some of these smaller projects or programs specifically around adaptation, so that you can crowd in finance both from public and private sources. So you know, those are some of the features that are particular to adaptation that still make that challenge very apparent.
Okay, I think we have time for just one last question. So how would you go about in countries where the domestic markets are underdeveloped? And this is a question from the Philippines, and you showed a case also from the Philippines, but you know, they are saying how to, and this could be valid for many other of the participants here today, over 300 participants. So how would you look at that?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it's actually the reality in many developing countries where the private financial market is not well developed. So it becomes a bit harder. Like something that we try to highlight also, like, and we try to show, is that there are different sources of financing, of course, that we think the private sector, but this happens also in developed countries, right? Like, should play a bigger role and have more participation. But in some countries still we rely and we need a lot of access from concessional finance, from multilateral development banks, and like a participation of national governments. And I think, of course, this shouldn't be the only solution. That's also why we are working on developing financial instruments in developing countries. So being able to try to tackle specific market failures, or actually sometimes non-existent markets, and how to still work with the private sector, but we have to highlight and also the role of all of these public institutions that need to be played. And I think something important here is that sometimes we have even like a lot of participation. I think it's the case of Philippines and a lot of different developing countries where we have a lot of international public institutions coming and like working and participating in projects. But what we need to highlight is that these projects need to be climate related, and like we have to focus on climate smart infrastructure. And of course, like we are working specifically in cities, we know that a lot of the countries have different needs, and but we need to make sure that the projects that we are developing, and in developing countries this is quite true because there are a lot of infrastructure that still need to be developed, that all this money that it's flowing there will definitely be climate related. So I think we are out of time, but thank you so much.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, and it was indeed a pleasure. And I think if you see the comments, there are a lot of congratulatory remarks, and also many interests to follow up with CCFLA. So I hope this will be a win-win for both. And with that, I hand over to Mai.
Thank you, Sanjay, and thank you, Ida and Priscilla. It was really a very interesting presentation, and definitely a good insight to our audience about climate finance and adaptation and preparation, project preparation facilities. There are a lot of questions on where we're going to be sharing the materials. It will be on the event page that we dropped the URL in the chat box. And I will be circulating this link also to your email tomorrow, together with the survey, in which we will be asking you for some of the feedbacks on what could be the next topic related to finance that you would want to hear more. And yeah, and all the presentation materials and the lab link and the green finance directory that Priscilla and Idan mentioned were already shared also in this event page that my colleague already dropped in chat box. So please stop by and check out for all the information that you may need. And thank you once again, and we'll reconvene in the near future for the next series on the finance for urban resilience. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day. Good night.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.